Kia ora koutou, welcome to Face to Face. Back with us, the wonderful Bernard Hickey. Kia ora, Bernard.
G'day.
The editor of Hive News. And this time we're going to be talking with Bernard about the target that the Reserve Bank uses for its monetary policy. So, Bernard, we talked before about how this sort of, you called it a doomsday machine of inflation targeting, and how we're going lower and lower, and that's just pumping asset prices higher and higher. What other options do you think the Reserve Bank has? Could we, or the government has, do you think, in terms of targeting something different?
Yeah, so the Reserve Bank could, for example, change its inflation target. So at the moment it's between 1 and 3%, and they, in theory, target around the midpoint of that. But
which would be 2, according to my maths.
That's right, we're onto it with the maths. And so should the Reserve Bank, because inflation right now is only 0.4%, and actually annualised it could go below naught, be deflation in the September quarter.
So they've been under-hitting their targets for quite some time.
So they need to do something. And to be fair, they are. They've just cut interest rates again, and they could cut them one more time this year, potentially in November. But still, they're not really hitting their targets. So there is a debate, should we change the targets? Should we, either lower the inflation target to get somewhere closer to where inflation is now? It's a bit like moving the goalpost, Can you imagine Dan Carter saying, can you please just move that goalpost a bit wider? So that's one way to do it. And there are some people who say, well, maybe we should actually lift the target. So instead of saying 2%, let's make it 4%.
And then really go for it.
Yeah, and then really get some heat into this economy, and also change expectations about inflation. Because that's one of the sort of a dance going on at the moment between the Reserve Bank and the business community. The business community can see that inflation is very low because their prices are either flat or in some cases falling. In fact, anything to do with what they call the tradable sector that competes with the rest of the world, commodity prices, exports, imports, that's actually been falling for 4 years.
And expectations are pretty important when it comes to inflation, because if you think prices are going to be low, then that's what you'll plan for, you won't purchase, and so it's all self-fulfilling prophecy, yeah?
That's right. The Reserve Bank says if everyone thinks that inflation is going to be really, really low or actually be deflation, then they start changing their pricing. So when they're going out to set their prices every day on the shelves, they go, gee, I think inflation is going to be really low, in fact we're going to have deflation, I'm going to cut the prices. Or they think when they're doing their wage negotiations with their workers, gee, inflation's really, really low, in fact it's deflation. You know what? I think it's time we think about cutting your wages. And of course that starts to turn into a spiral, and employees go, gee, if my wages are being cut, maybe I shouldn't spend. And when everyone's not spending, then you get into this downward spiral. So the Reserve Bank's really worried about falling inflation expectations. So you could do two things. Either you could lower the target, essentially say, well, Dan Carter can't kick very high at the moment, so we'll lower the bar on the goalposts. Or you say, let's increase the target, let's go for 4%, let's say, and that's what some people in the United States have talked about. And then everyone goes, gee, the Reserve Bank's really going to have to heat things up now. Maybe I should start increasing my prices and my wages ahead of it. So that's another way you could do it. And then the third way you could do it is to target something called nominal GDP.
Right, so this is the, instead of real GDP, if you like, which is, the sum of all, payments that are made in the economy, this is including prices along in that package, if you like.
That's right, because at the moment, the GDP measure we look at is real GDP, so it takes out inflation.
Yeah.
And the Reserve Bank doesn't really care about where GDP is going, they're only interested in inflation. But if you say, let's target nominal GDP, then you essentially take into account the size of the economy, if by ignoring prices. And that means if you've got very low inflation, you can essentially say, well, let's ignore the inflation and let's go for the nominal GDP, and that way we can. Yeah.
So you'll either be getting real GDP growth with low inflation, or low GDP growth with a bit of inflation.
Yeah. And so that way you sort of get out of this sort of loop of having to focus on low inflation.
How realistic do you think that is?
In New Zealand, I don't think it's really part of the debate at the moment. A, because the Reserve Bank is just locked into inflation targeting. Remember, New Zealand was the first in the world to actually do inflation targeting. We were there before the rest. We were pioneers in the inflation targeting game. And so if we change, it will be like, Edmund Hillary saying, "I've decided to give up on rock climbing." It's just
I'm going scuba diving instead.
That's right. It's a really big thing if New Zealand does it. And also, you could argue New Zealand's not quite at the level of desperation that some other countries are.
But these other countries, are they
Well,
talking about it?
there's a debate going on. They've just had a big conference at a place called Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Sounds like a golf course.
It is.
Hey,
a golf course next to a really spectacular mountain.
Okay.
It's like Queenstown with cowboy hats. It's a great place for central bankers to get together and talk about monetary policy. I don't think they look out the window much. There's a lot of talk about inflation targeting, and anyway, they all get together, and they've just had this big symposium where they talk about this sort of stuff, and a couple of these ideas came out there. So the rest of the world's talking about it. We're not really talking about it here yet, because remember, we've still got an official cash rate at 2%, which gives us a bit of room if we need to. Things. Let's say there was a shock. The next year or two, the Reserve Bank could still cut interest rates quite dramatically.
To move, yeah.
But, we're not far off from starting to talk about these things. And remember, if it's being talked about it elsewhere, we're part of the world. We can't ignore it. And certainly, if the rest of the world says, no, we're giving up on inflation targeting, we're going to target somewhere else, something else, then that's important for us. We need to keep an eye on it. And also, we're not that far above zero.
Yeah.
Because we're at 2%.
In the grand history of things,
yeah,
record lows. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. We're at 2% now. The Reserve Bank itself is planning to go to 1.5% or so in its central forecast. And actually, in its August monetary policy statement, it actually said, there's a couple of scenarios. Let's say the exchange rate stays quite high, or let's say inflation expectations start to fall. Then we would have to cut the official cash rate to below 1%. So then, that's not far above zero. Yeah. So, it's good to start thinking about these things before we get there, rather than having to do a panic job, at the end.
Great. Well, exciting times for monetary policy. You don't get to say that very often. Thanks, Bernard Hickey. Thanks for watching that right till the end. If you'd like to stay in touch with what we do here at the Morgan Foundation, click here or visit us at morganfoundation.org.nz. Ideas to action.